Gonzaga Nation SI. I'm your host, Dan Dickau, with another episode where we bring a little bit of a different perspective on things that are related to college basketball, Gonzaga centric. Today's guest, someone who has a ton of experience in the NIL space, even though it's only about 2 years old or so now. He's an author. He's a college athlete advocate. He's someone who has a lot of knowledge. And I think that will kind of open people's eyes if you listen to the entirety of this conversation. Someone who is a UCLA and USC fan, if you can get that one straight, if you live in Southern California. I don't know. I don't live down there, but maybe he can explain that a little bit himself. It's Marc Isenberg. Marc, thanks for joining.
Dan, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to whatever topics that we delve into. It's a fascinating time in college sports, and there's a lot of different angles that we can play. So I appreciate you having me on.
So I guess before we start getting into the Gonzaga-centric stuff, let's talk about the USC UCLA kind of dynamic in Southern California. They're both going to the Big Ten. I personally don't like the move. I think when you look at the Pac-8, then the Pac-10, then the Pac-12, these are your two of your flagship brands. You let them leave. How did that come about? Was it a shock? Was it a surprise? What is the thought now a year or so after it's been announced?
Yeah, I mean, on a personal perspective, it's obviously very disappointing that we grew up believing that the Pac-10 and then the Pac-12 was a Power Five conference, that it was here to stay. Gross mismanagement in the Pac-12, I think, was a big reason for the move. And again, I think that it would be better if we kept the status quo, but we also have to recognize that the college sports landscape is changing at such a rapid rate, and the cost of doing business just gets incrementally bigger and higher, and you have to adjust. And unfortunately, the powers that be at both those institutions felt that it was in their long-term best interest. I have no doubt for basketball and football, it's going to be smooth sailing. There's going to be a lot of money that's going to be coming into the coffers of those schools that move up to a higher revenue conference. You hope that they took into account the needs of all the athletes that they're servicing, the non-revenue producers, and just what it does for travel, the disruptions in their academic careers and everything else. So again, this is where we are in college sports. It is a cold, oftentimes heartless business, and we're just going to have to adjust, and just wanting to make sure that athletes that we care about have a seat at the table, that their needs are being met, and that we get out of this whole world. And I think this will bring into the conversation NIL, just the idea of, here are the rules. If you want to play college sports, you must live by them. I think that we're now reimagining where college sports is and what role college athletes should play in this multi-billion-dollar enterprise.
You used a word, adjust, that kind of struck me really quickly in that answer. I think everybody has to adjust in this new world of college sports. Athletic directors, coaches. I know you don't like the term student athletes, so college athletes have to adjust. Fans have to.
I always appreciate you, Dan, but you're a quick study.
How do you truly adjust when things are changing so quickly?
And that's the crux of everything that we're dealing with. The NCAA, and that's Indianapolis headquarters and the 1,000+ NCAA members, the DNA that they have created throughout their system and the way that they designed it is that college athletes are not members of the NCAA infrastructure. They don't have legitimacy in the governance structure. And so that really puts old line athletic administrators in a place where they're having trouble, going back to the word, adjusting. And so those of us that see the value in creating more of a partnership between the NCAA, their members, and now the athletes, to give them a way that they can have what they deserve. And again, we don't know what all of that looks like, but for the NCAA's 120-year history, it's basically been unilaterally determined what they get. And that is, for a while it was tuition, room and board, and then 10 years ago, we got the full cost of attendance stipends. And there was always this push to continue to expand their rights, and where the NCAA landed on, because they wanted to keep that whole status that athletes are students, not employees, that they want to make sure that athletes have the ability to now capitalize off of their name, image, and likeness. And so it's not a perfect solution by any stretch of the imagination, but that it opens the door for furthering the cause of what will lead to athletes, in my estimation, having a legitimate seat at the bargaining table, so that we can figure out what would be an equitable share of all the revenue that's coming in. And I think there's a lot of people that talk about, this is exactly the opposite of what college athletics stands for. And again, I'm a broken record. Adjust. The world of college athletics, they told us, was going to fall off its axis when athletes got paid for name, image, and likeness. It was going to hurt the non-revenue sports. It was going to hurt female athletes. A year and a half, almost 2 years into NIL, it hasn't been anywhere close to that. It has been a win-win for all parties in this brave new world of NIL.
I think it's fair to say certain athletes have been paid in football, in basketball for years, but it's been under the table. NIL has brought it to the light, and it makes a little bit more of a open sourced process, I guess you could say. What is the next step? Because I have said since this was announced, it's going to take a couple years to flush out what a going rate for a quarterback is, or a left tackle, or in basketball, a point guard or center on a high level team versus a mid-major. What's the next steps? Is it unionizing? Is it open? Like, I don't know if open source is the right word when you say contracts have to be able to be presented where everybody can see it, kind of like in professional sports. What are the next steps?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the next steps would be sort of just to get that historical perspective of how the NCAA envisioned NIL. So remember, they said that, the test for NIL would be that there was no inducements to sign with the school, no pay for play, and there had to be a quid pro quo. In other words, that if you were accepting money from a brand, that you would have to provide real bona fide NIL. So in effect, what the NCAA cleverly did was they sort of took all the meat off the bone of all the revenue that college sports generates, which is television revenue, ticket sales, and shoe deals. And they stripped that away from what NIL would be. And then they pushed what they thought NIL should be, taking place outside of the athletic department. That's what I think many of us have called real NIL. And that's awesome. The ability to use your name, image, and likeness to promote a product or service and earn whatever the market rate is for that. So 2 years into NIL, where do we land? There is still that bona fide NIL that we love, but there is sort of that element through the collectives that would definitely, if you held it up to the light of day, and you didn't want to do that wink, wink, would be pay for play. And so somehow it's passed test. And it's one of those things where that's not my issue to decide. I love when revenue from big time college athletics uh, flows in fair share to those that are helping to generate it. That's the labor pool, the college football players, basketball players. Now we're seeing women's sports really emerge. I mean, women's softball is on television all the time. The crowds are enormous. Women's basketball, the Final Four this year was unbelievable. So again, we're not saying that you have to pay them, but if we took away these artificial barriers, what is it that athletes would be paid in this open source, open market environment? And I think that we're getting to some of that through the collectives, but it's still a really cumbersome process that is fraught with NCAA rules. At some point, and I'm not a legal or tax expert, but I have to believe that the IRS is going to take a look and see, does this really pass the test for those collectives that have been set up as nonprofits? And is this a bona fide use of our tax code to pay athletes six figures, and then the quid pro quo would be doing different community service projects, visiting sick patients, all really good, but just a bizarre way to put money in the hands of athletes. So, and then I think that again, the changing landscape, at some point, it seems like we would all be better off if we could relocate this type of NIL activity within the confines of an athletic department, where it's established that you can donate to academic institutions, get your tax write-off. This has been going on for 100 plus years, and whatever scrutiny that the IRS has placed on collectives, I don't think that we have that problem. So I do think that at some point, that if we just keep trying to operate the collectives outside the athletic department, I don't know how it sustains itself either as a nonprofit where it could invite IRS scrutiny, or as a for-profit entity, and those who support their favorite programs would have to do it without the benefit of a tax donation.
You bring up interesting points. Like, is it a taxable donation? Is it just hiring somebody? These are all things that I don't think the average fan expects or thinks about when they see these high dollar numbers that, say, an Alabama quarterback gets, or Hunter Dickinson gets to go from Michigan to Kansas in basketball, even though Michigan is a very good basketball program. He didn't make very much money considering his my perceived value of what he brought to that university. When you look at the overall landscape, is there a certain school, an athletic department, or a community that is doing things maybe differently, uniquely, or better than anybody else?
And I think that that's the problem that everybody's having with NIL, is it's not one size fits all. And let me back up for a second, because NIL is not just about revenue maximization today. There's a lot of other factors that I think smart athletes and their families are factoring into in terms of their decision making. So to the extent that some of the upstart programs, it does level the playing field to a certain extent, because they now have the opportunity to throw big bucks at young athletes as an inducement, even though it's not necessarily within the bounds of NCAA rules, but they can do that. Another school would have different priorities. They would sort of view what they're doing as a component of the overall college experience. So they may not throw the big bucks, but when you factor in all of the aspects of why you would pick a particular institution, the academics, the athletic development, the ability to get exposure, the network for their sport, and beyond plays a huge role in this. So I think that we're just seeing a lot of bizarre outcomes because some students come from a situation where they're able to sort of see the bigger picture, and that's awesome. And some others, and there would be no judgment if somebody is offered 100,000 from one school and $500,000 from another institution, and they take the money. Again, these are all situations and scenarios that get into the mix because we've now not artificially determined that the value of the athletes would be their scholarship and everything else that goes along with it. Because now there's that element of the open market, and these markets on a micro level change from institution to institution. And so again, I think that the public doesn't necessarily understand or appreciate that these are heady times for college athletes. And you hope that they're getting good information, that if they're offered big money, that they have somebody that is on their side, whether it's a lawyer or an agent, that is protecting their legal and financial interests and making sure that this stuff is memorialized in writing so that there's some teeth in these contracts. Because I think that that's another fallout is that we're hearing reports of promises being made, and then they get on college campuses, and it hasn't been well documented, and now they're at the mercy of these collectives that have had a very short lifespan, and who's guaranteeing the collective revenue that has been promised. So again, this upends a lot of what college athletics has been about historically. And in some ways, I'm here for the drama. I feel like that we can deal with it.
Yeah, it's fun to follow.
It's fun to follow, and it's going to it's already led to some amazing outcomes in the NIL space, and athletes using the money, the platform, all the things that come with it to further their interests, whether it's in the community, supporting causes, taking care of teammates, starting to bring in enough revenue where you can save and invest, and getting a head start on wealth building is an unbelievable advantage for anybody in their 20s. But it's very rare to be able to make that kind of money early on. So again, you hope that they're making good decisions. I've talked a lot and tweeted about just this paternalistic view where, well, college athletes are too young, they're not prepared, they're not experienced. And my response to that is, too bad. I mean, these are real life decisions. There will be some mistakes that will be made, and there'll be some unfortunate outcomes. But I think that athletes, their families, the institutions, the coaches, I think are quick studies in recognizing that they need to step up. They need to understand the world that they now inhabit is different. It comes with greater responsibilities. There's opportunities to really make some decisions that will help them in the present and for the long term. And so, to the extent that they don't squander these opportunities and they make good decisions, I think that that's going to be the majority. There will be some athletes who do some really stupid things. I've certainly, written books and have geared a lot of my financial education around pulling back the curtains on this industry and giving them the tools that they can make better decisions. But again, we can't protect everybody. And I think it was always convenient that, well, the 18 to 22-year-olds aren't prepared, so we're just going to determine for their own best interest that we're not going to give them any pocket change to do with what they want. So here we are.
Well, you've talked about the kind of overall landscape, but you've also mentioned the word microclimate or micromarket. Sorry. So I view Gonzaga as a micro market, to be honest with you. This is a Gonzaga-centric podcast through Gonzaga Nation SI. Gonzaga is unique in that they are a national brand in a smaller market. The WCC isn't necessarily a small league. They're a very legitimate league, but they're not quite the Big 12. They're not quite the Pac-12, even though we've already discussed the struggles they've had, the Big 10, etc. Where do you, as kind of someone who looks at the overall lay of the land NIL, where do you see Gonzaga falling in this? Where are their opportunities? Where are their weaknesses? Where can they capitalize?
I think that Gonzaga is such a unique situation. It's almost like the Green Bay Packers of college basketball. That there's such a rabid fan base. There's such a culture of competing at the highest level within a conference that's not considered a Power Five, and so to the extent that there's a lot of conversations of do you go left, do you go right, do you go straight, do you try to chase something that's bigger, or are you comfortable where what you've done in the past, and that it is built for whatever times that we are in, and however things are changing, that Gonzaga has the ability to adapt without necessarily doing something that would be along the lines of radical change. So again, there was a book by William Goldman, Adventures in the Screen Trade, and it was just about like how do you predict the future? What movies are going to be successful? What should be green lit? What should they pass on? And William Goldman, who was a well-known screenwriter, producer, director, wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Princess Bride, 40 years in the screen trade, and he came up with his greatest takeaway in this whole world was nobody knows bleep. And so, to the extent that, I mean, it's really difficult because things are happening so quickly at the institutional level, at the conference level with realignment, and then at the NCAA level, trying to figure out, what is the best course forward. Is it federal legislation, which I'm completely against? I don't think that if I was a handicapper, or back to predictions, I don't think that in its present iteration of what we've heard there, the NCAA is lobbying for, will make it. And so now we're left with a patchwork of state laws. And I'm fine with that. Again, I mean, there's chaos that's coming from this. Can we come up with a better system? I think that we can. My personal preference is that it'll be more along the lines of athletes having a legitimate seat at the bargaining table, whether it's pay for play. Not that there's anything wrong with that phraseology, that they are providing valuable services and that they should be compensated for it, whether it's done on an individual basis or collectively. And that sort of opens up that can of worms of athletes being treated as employees. And there's, from my perspective, a lot of value in making sure that, we're not just creating this system that denies the realities of what's going on. So as far as, what's going on at the school that you love, and has given you so much, I think that the people who are running it are smart enough to sort of figure out where it's changing and who they are, what's their DNA. And, I don't think that you ever go to a school like Gonzaga for the academics and the basketball if it's transactional. But this is really, a perfect example of long-term decision making, and the value of a degree, the value of playing at the highest level for a program that has a proven track record for developing basketball players to play in the NBA, to play overseas. So again, I don't think they have to pay top dollar. They're going to do what they can to support their athletes, and recognize that that's just one component of the entire package that would be offered to prospective college athletes that are looking at Gonzaga versus a Pac-12 school, Big 12, ACC, SEC. And again, I think it's it has been compelling in the past, and I believe, not that I mean, going back to the William Goldman line, I mean, there's going to be some crazy things that are going to happen, but I think that the blue blood programs, we can have another interesting conversation of, is Gonzaga basketball a blue blood? For the purposes of this conversation and the audience that we serve, I think it really has, over the last 20 years, been unbelievably competitive. And I don't think that that's going to change one bit, no matter what happens in the NIL landscape, in the conference realignment world. You're going to be good.
You make some interesting points in regards to the overall view of Gonzaga with, and the way you put it was interesting, because I don't think a lot of people look at NIL as just money, right? But I think in a players in this day and age, you have to look at what you talked about, the academic, the future networking possibilities, the ability to get to your aspirations of probably playing in the NBA. Most guys, that if you're going to go to a high-level program, you think you're going to get there. So you tie all these things together, but you also have to kind of have an NIL number that, if I can get close to this during this stage of my career, it's worth it. And then you balance it out and you figure out what makes sense. But when you look at the overall gist of college athletics, when you look at location, academics, NIL, if you had a son or daughter right now that was making a decision, is there a school that stands out to you?
It's interesting. I mean, there's schools that I root for. I'm a season ticket holder for UCLA basketball. I've bought the NIL experience at USC Annenberg. I think that, there's, back to the sort of the whole concept that there's no one size fits all. There's, I mean, there's so many different factors. I've had conversations with people that, had UCLA on their radar, and it just was not a good fit. So that there's just so many different aspects. Obviously, I like forward-thinking athletic administrators. I like schools that support the college athlete, whether it's with regard to NIL, whether it's with regard to what is it that we're trying to accomplish in the college athletic experience. So, you can go to a school that I hold near and dear, but you can get, a coaching staff that's in turmoil, a coaching staff that is not a good fit. So I hate when people ask me questions and I'm evasive, but I just did it.
Well, yeah, no, you're right. So I'm going to leave you with one last question, and maybe at some point later this summer, because as we said throughout this conversation, NIL is constantly changing, right? I'd love to have you on later this fall as we get closer to the basketball season and we see how some of the football stuff has played out, because sometimes transfers put their name in the portal because the NIL market, unfortunately, isn't working the way they want. I don't agree with that, but that's just my prerogative. But my last question for you, Mark, is this. Professional sports, they all have a players association, a union. Is college athletics moving in that direction? Does it need to move in that direction to protect some of these student athletes, or give them a little bit more guidance, or maybe help prepare them for 5, 6, 7 years down the road when they're no longer in college?
So at one point during this conversation, I know I referred to the chaos, and that it's okay to have that as an alternative to the unilateral decisions that were made in the best interest of the institution and the athletic department and the coaches. And so then, so that's NIL 1.0. It's still not perfect. But as we move forward, what would be, the best resolution that would take into account all the various stakeholders? And so, one of the things that I think that with, NIL, that we've seen some really positive outcomes along the lines of, an elite player that tests the NBA waters, and then realizes that he can make several $100,000. In the women's basketball landscape, it's like no question. I mean, in terms of why would you leave women's college basketball for a dramatic pay cut? And so the idea of NIL, or a mechanism to compensate college athletes to keep them in school longer, is a awesome outcome of the changing landscape. When it comes to the transfer portal and the perceived epidemic, which I completely reject. I've published stats that show that college basketball players transfer at a rate lower than the general student population.
Really? I had no idea, because I was a player who transferred. It worked out unbelievably well for me. At the time I transferred, it was not normal, but I did not know the stat that you just mentioned.
So, the idea that college students who stay at one institution perform better because all the academic credits, don't have to transfer along with it, keeps them on track to graduate. Certainly the optimal outcome of when a student selects a college is that he or she would stay there for 4 or 5 years. But we also recognize that the transfer rate among all students is fairly high. Now, schools push back on that because there's such an investment in a college athlete, in keeping them there. And so, the idea, this goes back to, in the past, there was the ability to transfer was predicated on sitting out a year. The schools would have to grant you access, and they could steer you away from schools that they didn't want you to attend. But this is really the interesting argument that the NCAA used so effectively for 70, 80 years, which is the college athletes are students, not employees. Well, students have the absolute right to transfer without penalty. And so at some point, the NCAA and their membership made the determination that we have to keep them as students and give them the same rights as every other student, which definitely opened up the floodgates. So let's tie this back to the fact that we're now recognizing that the world of college athletics is going to be just fine if athletes are a part of this, economic largesse. And so, now we don't have to treat them like students, and we can treat them like employees. So then, what I think would be fascinating, not just as an incentive to keep athletes in school longer, but to retain them through some form of an employment contract. And so that could be multiple years. So if you want to go to a particular school, they may not be offering a 1-year contract. They might say, we want 2, 3, or 4 years, and in exchange, you're going to receive a fair amount of money. And there's going to be some restrictions that would be along the lines of non-compete, the inability to sign with another institution because you are under contract with that institution. And again, I think that would be an amazing outcome. If they did want to transfer or turn pro, maybe there's some form of a buyout so that the school that that offered a multi-year contract and is not getting their services for those number of years can adjust, and that they, that there's, just like a coach that leaves for another institution, that they can, receive a buyout settlement, and that would be perfectly fine.
Those are some fascinating and great ideas. I think it's going to be, I would imagine that's eye-opening for a lot of our listeners, some of the stuff that you shared, especially at the end, because I hadn't looked at it in that way in regards to the student transfer versus college athlete transfer rates. So that's some really great stuff. Marc, I appreciate the time. At some point, maybe end of the summer, early fall. Gonna have to have you on again because you are obviously well versed in NIL, in college athletes' rights or ideas and options and how to move this thing forward. I really appreciate the time and thank you very much.
No, thank you. I feel like we were scratching the surface. So if that leads to the second conversation a couple of months later, it would be my pleasure. I enjoyed it.